what will happen next. Canada's skyline is breathtaking, its cities bustling. But behind the glass towers and busy streets, there's a growing crisis. One that's getting worse by the day. Right now, over 235,000 people experience homelessness in Canada every single year. That's enough to fill an entire mid-sized city. And now things could be about to get even worse.
Canada is very tough. They're very, very tough to do business with. And we can't let them take advantage of the U.S.
And ultimately, out on the streets. What does the U.S. Canada trade war have to do with homelessness? More than you might think. Because when industries struggle, jobs disappear. And when people can't afford rent, they lose their homes. So today, we're breaking it all down. What's really behind Canada's homelessness crisis? Why could U.S. tariffs push even more people into poverty? And most importantly, what can be done before it's too late? Canada's homelessness crisis, how U.S. tariffs could make it worse. Alright, let's start with the basics. Because before we even talk about the U.S. and trade wars, we need to understand just how bad things already are in Canada. Let's be real. When you think of homelessness, what comes to mind? A person sleeping on a park bench? Tents lined up under a bridge? Maybe someone holding a sign on a street corner? Yeah, that's part of it. But what if I told you that hundreds of thousands of homeless Canadians are actually invisible? Hidden in plain sight? Right now, over 235,000 people in Canada experience homelessness every year. That's not just a statistic, that's a city's worth of people with nowhere stable to call home. And every single night, at least 25,000 people are sleeping in shelters, on the streets, or in public spaces. Think about that. Entire families, people just like you and me, who had jobs, homes, dreams, and now, they're struggling just to survive another day. But here's where it gets worse. You don't even need to be on the streets to be homeless. Ever heard of hidden homelessness? This is when people bounce between friends' couches, live in their cars, or stay in overcrowded, unstable housing. They're not counted in those shelter statistics, but they're just as vulnerable. And get this, over 400,000 Canadians experience hidden homelessness every year. Let me ask you something. Have you ever struggled to pay rent? Ever had a month where money was so tight, you had to cut back on groceries, skip a bill, or borrow from someone just to make ends meet? Now imagine that being your reality every single day. Imagine waking up, not knowing where you'll sleep next week, or even tomorrow. And the crazy part? This isn't just happening in big cities like Toronto and Vancouver. It's spreading fast. In just 4 years, homelessness in Greater Victoria nearly doubled. That's a 100% increase. Let that sink in. So why is this happening? What's pushing more and more people onto the edge? Well, here's where things start to get even more uncomfortable. Because a huge part of the problem is the cost of simply existing in Canada has skyrocketed. Let's talk money, because at the end of the day, that's what this crisis really comes down to. If you can't afford a place to live, you end up homeless. Simple as that. Now tell me, how much do you think the average one-bedroom apartment in Toronto costs right now? Maybe $1,500? $2,000? Try $2,600, and that's just for a modest unit. Think about that for a second. If you're working full-time at Ontario's minimum wage of $16.55 an hour, your entire monthly income before taxes is just over $2,650. That means after rent, you've got almost nothing left for food, transportation, healthcare, or, heaven forbid, savings. And it's not just Toronto. Vancouver, Montreal, Calgary, rents are at record highs everywhere. But here's the real kicker. Wages? They're not keeping up. In the past 5 years, rental costs in cities like Vancouver have jumped by nearly 25%, while wages have barely budged. That means more and more people are being squeezed out of their homes, not because they're lazy, not because they don't want to work, but because they simply can't afford to exist. And let's be real. How many people do you know who are one unexpected expense away from financial disaster? A car breaks down, a medical bill pops up, or, boom, your landlord raises your rent by a few $100. Suddenly, you're making impossible choices. Do I pay rent or do I eat? Do I keep the lights on or do I buy my medication? And if you can't keep up, if you fall behind just once, you could lose everything. That's exactly what's happening to thousands of people across Canada right now. 1 month, they have a place to live. The next, they're out on the street. And once you're there, climbing back up, it's nearly impossible. So yeah, the homelessness crisis in Canada is already out of control. But here's where things get really scary. Because if you think it's bad now, imagine what happens when an economic shock, like U.S. tariffs, comes into play. That could push thousands more Canadians over the edge. Let's break it down. What if I told you the next wave of homelessness in Canada won't come from rising rents, but from across the border? Canada and the U.S. have one of the closest economic relationships in the world. Billions of dollars in trade flow between the two countries every year. But now, with new tariffs being discussed, that relationship is looking more unstable than ever. If these tariffs go into effect, they won't just be numbers on a spreadsheet. They'll have real consequences for real people. Businesses that rely on exports to the US could struggle to stay profitable. Factories could slow down production. Layoffs would follow. And with fewer jobs, more Canadians could be pushed to the edge financially. Think about industries like manufacturing, agriculture, and energy, sectors that employ millions of Canadians. If tariffs make it too expensive for US companies to buy Canadian goods, those industries could shrink overnight. Workers could see their hours cut, wages drop, or their jobs disappear altogether. And let's be honest, losing a job today is more dangerous than ever. Rent is sky high, the cost of living keeps climbing, and most people don't have a safety net. If you're already living paycheck to paycheck, a sudden layoff can be the beginning of a downward spiral. Miss one rent payment and you're at risk of eviction. Miss a few more and you could find yourself with nowhere to go. And here's where it gets even worse. As unemployment rises, so does competition for affordable housing. More people searching for cheaper places to live means landlords can raise prices even further. And those who can't keep up? They'll be left behind. We've seen this kind of economic shock before. Back in 2008, when the global financial crisis hit, thousands of Canadians lost their homes. Shelters filled up, homelessness skyrocketed, and it took years to recover. If these tariffs take effect, we could be looking at a similar situation. But this time, with rents even higher, wages even lower, and social services already stretched to their limits. So let me ask you, how many people do you think could handle a sudden financial hit right now? How many could afford to lose their jobs and still pay rent? For millions of Canadians, the answer is simple. They couldn't. And that's why this crisis isn't just about homelessness as we see it today. It's about how much worse it could get. But what about the people already living through it? The ones who are already out on the streets, already struggling to get by? They're facing a whole different battle, and it's about survival. Let's talk about what life is really like when you don't have a home. Imagine waking up every morning with no bed, no privacy, and no certainty about where you'll sleep that night. Imagine having to carry everything you own in a backpack, navigating a world that seems to pretend you don't exist. For thousands of homeless Canadians, this is reality. And the daily struggle? It's brutal. First, there's the constant search for a safe place to sleep. Shelters fill up fast, and in many cities, demand far outweighs supply. That means some people are forced to sleep in tents, bus stops, or alleyways, anywhere they can find a bit of shelter. And if you think that's rough in the summer, imagine facing it in the dead of winter when temperatures drop below freezing. Then there's food. Sure, food banks and soup kitchens exist, but they're not always easy to access, and they don't always provide enough to keep someone properly fed. When you're struggling just to find your next meal, how do you even begin to think about long-term solutions like finding a job or permanent housing? And let's not forget about health. Living on the streets takes a serious toll on the body and mind. Homeless individuals are far more likely to suffer from chronic illnesses, untreated infections, and mental health issues. And without stable housing, basic health care, like seeing a doctor, getting medication, or even just staying warm, becomes almost impossible. But perhaps the biggest struggle? The way society treats you. When people see someone sleeping on a sidewalk or asking for spare change, they rarely stop to think about how that person got there. The most common assumption? That it's their fault, that they made bad choices, that they should just get a job. But let's get real. How do you find a job when you don't have an address to put on a job application? When you don't have clean clothes for an interview? When you're exhausted from spending every night trying to stay safe? And now, with potential US tariffs looming and job losses on the horizon, even more people could be pushed into this cycle. People who never thought they'd experience homelessness. People who had stable jobs, families, and savings until they didn't. This crisis isn't about individual failure. It's about a system that's failing too many people. So what's being done about it? Are there real solutions? Or are we just watching things get worse year after year? Let's take a look at the response. From the government, from communities, and from people who are fighting to make a difference. There's hope. Organizations are stepping up, fighting every day, making an impact. But here's the harsh reality. It's not enough. Not even close. Let's start with the government's approach. Canada has programs aimed at reducing homelessness. Things like Housing First, which focuses on getting people into stable housing before addressing other issues like employment or mental health. Sounds great, right? And in many cases it works. Giving people a safe place to live is the first step to helping them rebuild their lives. But here's the problem. There simply aren't enough affordable homes to go around. Right now in Toronto alone, over 880,000 households are on the wait list for affordable housing. Some families are waiting years just for a chance at stability. And as rent prices keep climbing, those wait lists are only getting longer. Then there's emergency shelter funding. Cities across Canada are pouring money into short-term shelters, but many of them are already beyond capacity. That means people get turned away. And when shelters are full, people are left with nowhere to go. And while we're at it, let's talk about the funding itself. In 2017, Canada launched its National Housing Strategy, promising billions of dollars to address the crisis. But years later, homelessness is still rising. Why? Because throwing money at a broken system without fixing its core problems, like the lack of affordable housing, won't solve anything. So what about local efforts? Are communities stepping up where the government falls short? The answer is yes, but it's still not enough. Organizations like Covenant House, Raising the Roof, and the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness are doing incredible work. They provide housing, mental health support, job training, and other essential services. And they've helped thousands of people get back on their feet. But they rely on donations, on volunteers, on a public that's willing to care. And in an economic downturn, when people have less to give, these organizations struggle to keep up. So here's the uncomfortable truth. If nothing changes, this crisis will only get worse. If U.S. tariffs lead to widespread job losses, the number of people struggling to afford rent will explode. Shelters will be even more overwhelmed. More people will be forced into homelessness. And the cycle will continue, because we're treating the symptoms, not the disease. And this is where you come in. Because change doesn't just happen at the government level. It happens when people demand better. It happens when we stop blaming individuals for a system that's broken and start pushing for real solutions. So what can you do? It starts with awareness. Talk about this issue. Share this video. Challenge the way people think about homelessness. It continues with action. Support organizations working on the front lines. Donate if you can. Volunteer if you have time. And it ends with accountability. Push for better policies. Demand more from leaders. Because housing isn't a luxury, it's a basic human right. So let me ask you, what do you think is the biggest cause of homelessness in Canada? Is it the lack of affordable housing? Rising inflation? Job loss? Or something else entirely? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's start a conversation. And if you made it this far, you're already part of the change. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.